This is an audiobook for Stephen King's The Dark Tower series, continuing with Book 2, The Drawing of the Three, Part 3, The Lady of Shadows, and Chapter 4, Detta on the Other Side. Like before, I'm going to be splitting this chapter into two pieces. 1. You must be on your guard, the gunslinger said, and Eddie had agreed, but the gunslinger knew Eddie didn't know what he was talking about. The whole back half of Eddie's mind, where survival is or isn't, didn't get the message. The gunslinger saw this. It was a good thing for Eddie he did. 2. In the middle of the night, Detta Walker's eyes sprang open. They were full of starlight and clear intelligence. She remembered everything. How she had fought them, how they had tied her to her chair, how they had taunted her, calling her words that I will not say. She remembered monsters coming out of the waves, and she remembered how one of the men, the older, had killed one of them. The younger had built a fire and cooked it, and then offered her smoking monster meat on a stick, grinning. She remembered spitting at his face, remembered his grin turning into an angry, honky scowl. He had hit her upside the face and told her, "Well, that's all right, you'll come around, wait and see if you don't." Then he and the really bad man had laughed, and the really bad man had brought out a haunch of beef, which he spitted and cooked slowly over the fire of the beach, of this alien place to which they had brought her. The smell of the slowly roasting beef had been seductive, but she had made no sign. Even when the younger one had waved a chunk of it near her face, chanting, "Bite for it, go on and bite for it," she had sat like stone, holding herself in. Then she had slept, and now she was awake, and the ropes they had tied her with were gone. She was no longer in the chair, but lying on one blanket and under another, far above the high tide line where the lobster things still wondered and questioned and snatched the odd, unfortunate gull out of the air. She looked to her left and saw nothing. She looked to her right and saw two sleeping men wrapped in two piles of blankets. The younger one was closer, and the really bad man had taken off his gun belts and laid them by. The guns were still in them. "You made a bad mistake, Muffa," Detta thought, and rolled to her right. The gritty crunch and squeak of her body on the sand was inaudible under the wind, the waves, the questioning creatures. She crawled slowly along the sand, like one of the lobstrosities herself, her eyes glittering. She reached the gun belts and pulled one of the guns. It was very heavy, the grip smooth and somehow independently deadly in her hand. The heaviness didn't bother her. She had strong arms, did Detta Walker. She crawled a little further. The younger man was no more than a snoring rock, but the really bad man stirred a little in his sleep, and she froze with a snarl tattooed on her face until he quieted again. "He be one sneaky sumbitch. You check, Detta, you check, be show." She found the worn chamber release, tried to shove it forward, got nothing, and pulled it instead. The chamber swung open. "Loaded. Fucker be loaded. You gon' do this, young cock to walk first, and dat really bad man be wakin' up, and you gon' give him one big grin. Smile, honey child, so I can see where you is, and den you gon' clean his clock something righteous." She swung the chamber back and started to pull the hammer, and then waited. When the wind picked up a gust, she pulled the hammer to full cock. Detta pointed Roland's gun at Eddie's temple. 3. The gunslinger watched all of this from one half-open eye. The fever was back, but not bad yet. Not so bad that he must mistrust himself. So he waited. That one half-open eye, the finger on the trigger of his body, the body which had always been his revolver when there was no revolver at hand. She pulled the trigger. Click. Of course, click. When he and Eddie had come back with the waterskins from their palaval, Odetta Holmes had been deeply asleep in her wheelchair, slumped to one side. They had made her the best bed they could on the sand and carried her gently from the wheelchair to the spread blankets. Eddie had been sure she would awake, but Roland knew better. He had killed, Eddie had built the fire, and they had eaten, saving a portion aside for Odetta in the morning. Then they had talked, and Eddie had said something which burst upon Roland like a sudden flare of lightning. It was too bright and too brief to be total understanding, but he saw much, the way one may discern the lay of the land in a single lucky stroke of lightning. He could have told Eddie then, but did not. He understood that he must be Eddie's Court. And when one of Court's pupils was left hurt and bleeding by some unexpected blow, Court's response had always been the same. A child doesn't understand a hammer until he's mashed his finger at the nail. "Get up and stop whining, maggot. You have forgotten the face of your father." So Eddie had fallen asleep, even though Roland had told him he must be on his guard, and when Roland was sure they both slept, he had waited longer for the lady who could, he thought, be sly. He had reloaded his guns with spent casings, unstrapped them, that caused a pang, and put them by Eddie. Then he waited. 1 hour, 2, 3. Halfway through the 4th hour, as his tired and feverish body tried to drowse, he sensed rather than saw the lady come awake and came fully awake himself. He watched her roll over. He watched her turn her hands into claws and hurl herself along the sand to where his gun belts lay. He watched her take one of them out, come closer to Eddie, and then pause, her head cocking, her nostrils swelling and contracting, doing more than smelling the air. Tasting it. Yes, this was the woman he had brought across. When she glanced toward the gunslinger, he did more than feign sleep, because she would have sensed sham. He went to sleep. When he sensed her gaze shift away, he awoke and opened that single eye again. He saw her begin to raise the gun. She did this with less effort than Eddie had shown the first time Roland had seen him do the same thing, and point it toward Eddie's head. Then she paused, her face filled with an inexpressible cunning. In that moment, she reminded him of Martin. She fiddled with the cylinder, getting it wrong at first, then swinging it open. She looked at the heads of the shells. Roland tensed, waiting first to see if she would know the firing pins had already been struck, waiting next to see if she would turn the gun, look into the other end of the cylinder, and see that there were only emptiness there instead of lead. He had already thought of loading the guns with cartridges, which had already misfired, but only briefly. Court had taught them that every gun is ultimately ruled by Old Man Splitfoot, and a cartridge which misfires once may not do so a second time. If she did that, he would spring it once. But she swung the cylinder back in, began to cock the hammer, and then paused again. Paused for the wind to mask the single low click. He thought, here's another. God, she's evil, this one, and she's legless, but she's a gunslinger as surely as Eddie is one. He waited with her. The wind gusted. She pulled the hammer to full cock and placed it a half an inch from Eddie's temple. With a grin that was a ghoul's grimace, she pulled the trigger. Click. He waited. She pulled it again, and again, and again. Click, click, click. Muffa, she screamed, and reversed the gun with liquid grace. Roland coiled but did not leap. A child doesn't understand a hammer until he's mashed his finger at a nail. If she kills him, she kills you. Doesn't matter, the voice of Court answered inexorably. Eddie stirred, and his reflexes were not bad. He moved fast enough to avoid being driven unconscious or killed. Instead of coming down on the vulnerable temple, the heavy gun belt cracked the side of his jaw. What Jesus? Maffa, hunky Maffa, Detta screamed, and Roland saw her raise the gun a second time, and even though she was legless and Eddie was rolling away, it was as much as he dared. If Eddie hadn't learned the lesson now, he never would. The next time the gunslinger told Eddie to be on his guard, Eddie would be, and besides, the bitch was quick. It would not be wise to depend further than this on either Eddie's quickness or the lady's infirmity. He uncoiled, flying over Eddie and knocking her backward, ending up on top of her. You want it, Muffa? She screamed at him, simultaneously rolling her crotch against his groin and raising the arm which still held the gun above his head. You want it? I gon' give it to you. Show. Eddie, he shouted again, not just yelling now, but commanding. For a moment, Eddie just went on squatting there, eyes wide, blood dripping from his jaw. It had already begun to swell. Staring, eyes wide. Move, can't you move, he thought? Or is it that you don't want to? His strength was fading now, but the next time she brought that heavy gun butt down, she was going to break his arm with it. That was if he got his arm up in time. If he didn't, she was going to break his head with it. Then Eddie moved. He caught the gun on the downswing, and she shrieked, turning toward him, biting at him like a vampire, cursing him in a gutter patois so darkly southern that even Eddie couldn't understand it. To Roland, it sounded as if the woman had suddenly begun to speak in a foreign language. But Eddie was able to yank the gun out of her hand, and with the impending bludgeon gone, Roland was able to pin her. She did not quit even then, but continued to buck and heave and curse, sweat standing out all over her dark face. Eddie stared, mouth opening and closing like the mouth of a fish. He touched tentatively at his jaw, winced, pulled his fingers back, examined them and the blood on them. She was screaming that she would kill them both. They could try and rape her, but she would kill them with her cunt. They would see. That was one bad son of a bitching cave with teeth around the entrance, and if they wanted to try and explore it, they would find out. What in the hell? Eddie said stupidly. One of my gun belts, the gunslinger panted harshly at him. Get it, I'm going to roll her on top of me, and you're going to grab her arms and tie her hands behind her. You ain't never. Detta shrieked, and sunfished her legless body with such sudden force that she almost bucked Roland off. He felt her trying to bring the remainder of her right thigh up again and again, wanting to drive it into his balls. She... Move, God curse your father's face, Roland roared, and at last, Eddie moved. 4. They almost lost control of her twice during the tying and binding, but Eddie was at last able to slip not one of Roland's gun belts around her wrists when Roland, using all of his force, finally brought them together behind her, all of the time drawing back from her lunging bites like a mongoose from a snake. The bites he avoided, but before Eddie had finished, the gunslinger was drenched with spittle, and then Eddie dragged her off, holding the short leash of the makeshift slipknot to do it. He did not want to hurt this thrashing, screaming, cursing thing. It was uglier than the monstrosities by far because of the greater intelligence which informed it, but he knew it could also be beautiful. He did not want to harm the other person the vessel held somewhere inside it, like a live dove deep inside one of the secret compartments in a magician's magic box. Odetta Holmes was somewhere inside that screaming, screeching thing. 5. Although his last mount, a mule, had died too long ago to remember, the gunslinger still had a piece of its tether rope, which in turn had once been a fine gunslinger's lariat. They used this to bind her to the wheelchair, as she had imagined or falsely remembered, and in the end, they both came to the same thing, didn't they? They had done already. Then they drew away from her. If not for the cawing lobster things, Eddie would have gone down to the water and washed his hands. I feel like I'm going to vomit, he said in a voice that jig-jagged up and down the scale, like the voice of an adolescent boy. Why don't you go on and eat each other's cocks? The struggling thing in the chair screeched. Why don't you just go on and do that if you so afraid of a black woman's cunny? You just go on show, suck each other's candles, do it while you got a chance, 'cause Detta Walker gon' get out this chair and cut them skinny old white candles off and feed them to those walking buzzsaws down there. She's the woman I was in. Do you believe me now? I believed you before, Eddie said. I told you that. You believed, you believed. You believed on the top of your mind. Do you believe it all the way down now? All the way to the bottom? Eddie looked at the shrieking, convulsing thing in the chair and then looked away, white except for the slash on his jaw, which was still dripping a little. That side of his face was beginning to look a little like a balloon. Yes, he said. God, yes. This woman is a monster. Eddie began to cry. The gunslinger wanted to comfort him, could not commit such a sacrilege, he remembered Jake too well, and walked off into the dark with his new fever burning and aching inside of him. 6. Much earlier on that night, while Odetta still slept, Eddie said he thought he might understand what was wrong with her. Might. The gunslinger asked what he meant. She could be a schizophrenic. Roland only shook his head. Eddie explained what he understood of schizophrenia, gleanings from such films as The Three Faces of Eve and various TV programs, mostly the soap operas he and Eddie had often watched while stoned. Roland had nodded. Yes, the disease Eddie described sounded about right. The woman with two faces, one light and one dark. The face like the one the man in black had shown him on the 5th tarot card. And they don't know, these schizophrenics, that they have another? No, Eddie said, but he trailed off, moodily watching the monstrosities crawl and question and crawl. But what? I ain't no shrink, Eddie said, so I don't really know. Shrink? What is a shrink? Eddie tapped his temple. A head doctor. A doctor for your mind. There's called psychiatrists. Roland nodded. He liked shrink better, because this lady's mind was too large, twice as large as it needed to be. But I think schizos almost always know something is wrong with them, Eddie said, because there are blanks. Maybe I'm wrong, but I always got the idea that they were usually two people who thought they had partial amnesia because of the blank spaces in their memory when the other personality was in control. She says she remembers everything. She really thinks she remembers everything. I thought you said she didn't believe any of this was happening. Yeah, Eddie said, but forget that for now. I'm trying to say that no matter what she believes, what she remembers goes right from her living room, where she was sitting in her bathrobe watching the midnight news, to here with no breaks at all. She doesn't have any sense that some other person took over between then and when you grabbed her in Macy's. Hell, that might have been the next day or even weeks later. I know it was still winter because most of the shoppers in that store were wearing coats. The gunslinger nodded. Eddie's perceptions were sharpening. That was good. He had missed the boots and scarves, the gloves sticking out of coat pockets, but it was still a start. But otherwise, it's impossible to tell how long Odetta was that other woman because she doesn't know. I think she's in a situation she's never been in before. And her way of protecting both sides is this story about getting cracked over the head. Roland nodded. And the rings. Seeing those really shook her up. She tried not to show it, but it showed all right. Roland asked if these two women don't know they exist in the same body, and if they don't even suspect that something may be wrong, if each has her own separate chain of memories, partly real but partly made up to fit the times the other is there, Then what are we to do with her? How are we even to live with her? Eddie shrugged. Don't ask me. It's your problem. You're the one who says you need her. Hell, you risked your neck to bring her here. Eddie thought about this for a minute, remembered squatting over Roland's body with Roland's knife held up just below the gunslinger's throat, and laughed abruptly and without humor. Literally risked your neck, man, he thought. A silence fell between them. Odetta had by then been breathing quietly. As the gunslinger was about to reiterate his warning for Eddie to be on guard and announce, loud enough for the lady to hear, if she was only shamming, that he was going to turn in, Eddie said the thing which lighted Roland's mind in a single sudden glare, the thing which made him understand at least part of what he needed so badly to know. At the end, when they came through. She hadn't changed at the end. And he had seen something. Tell you what, Eddie said, moodily stirring the remains of the fire with a spit claw from the night's kill. When you brought her through, I felt like I was a schizo. Why? Eddie thought, then shrugged. It was too hard to explain, or maybe he was just too tired. It's not important. Why? Eddie looked at Roland, saw he was asking a serious question for a serious reason, or thought he was, and took a minute to think back. It's really hard to describe, man. It was looking in that door. That's what freaked me out. When you see someone move in that door, it's like you're moving with them. You know what I'm talking about. Roland nodded. Well, I watched it like it was a movie. Never mind, it's not important. Until the very end. Then you turned her toward this side of the doorway, and for the first time I was looking at myself. It was like he groped and could find nothing. I don't know. It should have been like looking in a mirror, I guess, but it wasn't because it was like looking at another person. It was like being turned inside out, like being in two places at the same time. Shit, I don't know. The gunslinger was thunderstruck. That was what he had sensed as they came through. That was what had happened to her. No, not just her, them. For a moment, Detta and Odetta had looked at each other, not the way one would look at her reflection in a mirror, but as separate people. The mirror became a window pane, and for a moment, Odetta had seen Detta and Detta had seen Odetta, and had been equally horror-struck. They know each other, the gunslinger thought grimly. They may not have known before, but they do now. They can try to hide it from themselves, but for a moment they saw, they knew, and that knowing must still be there. Roland? What? Just wanted to make sure you hadn't gone to sleep with your eyes open, because for a minute you looked like you were, long ago and far away. If so, I'm back now, the gunslinger said. I'm going to turn in. Remember what I said, Eddie. Be on your guard. I'll watch, Eddie said, but Roland knew that, sick or not, he would have to be the one to do the watching tonight. Everything else had followed from that. 7. Following the ruckus, Eddie and Detta Walker eventually went to sleep again. She did not so much fall asleep as drop into an exhausted state of unconsciousness in her chair, lolling to one side against the restraining ropes. The gunslinger, however, lay wakeful. I will have to bring the two of them to battle, he thought, but he didn't need one of Eddie's shrinks to tell him that such a battle might be to the death. If the bright one, Odetta, were to win that battle, all might yet be well. If the dark one were to win it, all would surely be lost with her. Yet he sensed that what really needed doing was not killing, but joining. He had already recognized much of the value that would be to him, them, in Detta Walker's gutter toughness. And he wanted her, but he wanted her under control. There was a long way to go. Detta thought he and Eddie were monsters of some species she called honk mathas. That was only dangerous delusion, but there would be real monsters along the way. The Libstrosities were not the first, nor would they be the last. The fight until you drop woman he had entered and who had come out of hiding again tonight might come in very handy in a fight against such monsters, if she could be tempered with Odetta Holmes' calm humanity. Especially now, with him short 2 fingers, almost out of bullets, and growing more fever. But that is a step ahead. I think I can make them acknowledge each other. That would bring them into confrontation. How may it be done? He lay awake all that long night thinking, and although he felt the fever in him grow, he found no answer to his question. 8. Eddie woke up shortly before daybreak, saw the gunslinger sitting near the ashes of last night's fire with his blanket wrapped around him Indian fashion, and joined him. How do you feel? Eddie asked in a low voice. The lady still slept in her crisscrossing of ropes, although she occasionally jerked and muttered and moaned. All right. Eddie gave him an appraising glance. You don't look all right. Thank you, Eddie, the gunslinger said dryly. You're shivering. It will pass. The gunslinger jerked and moaned again, this time a word that was almost understandable. It might have been Oxford. God, I hate to see her tied up like that, Eddie murmured, like a goddamn calf in a barn. She'll wake soon. Mayhap we can unloose her when she does." It was the closest either of them came to saying out loud that when the lady in the chair opened her eyes, the calm, if slightly puzzled gaze of Odetta Holmes might greet them. 15 minutes later, as the first sun rays struck over the hills, those eyes did open. But what the men saw was not the calm gaze of Odetta Holmes, but the mad glare of Detta Walker. "How many times you done raped me while I was buzzed out?" she asked. "My cunt feel all slick and tallowy, like somebody done been at it with a couple of them little bitty white candles you gray meat moffas called cocks." "Roll inside. Let's get going," he said, and gained his feet with a grimace. "I ain't going nowhere with you, Maffa," Detta spat. "Oh, yes, you are," Eddie said. "Dreadfully sorry, my dear." "Where do you think I'm going?" "Well," Eddie said, "what was behind door number 1 wasn't so hot, and what was behind door number 2 was even worse, so now instead of quitting like sane people, we're going to go right on ahead and check out door number 3. The way things have been going, I think it's likely to be something like Godzilla or Ghidorah or the three-headed monster, but I'm an optimist. I'm still hoping for the stainless steel cookware." "I ain't going." "You're going, all right," Eddie said, and walked behind her chair. She struggled again, but the gunslinger had made these knots, and her struggles only drew them tighter. Soon enough, she saw this and ceased. She was full of poison, but far from stupid. But she looked back over her shoulder at Eddie with a grin which made him recoil a little. It seemed to him the most evil expression he had ever seen on a human face. "Well, maybe I go in a little way," she said, "but maybe it's not so far as you think, white boy, and sure God, not as fast as you think." "What do you mean?" That leering over the shoulder grin again. "You'll find out, white boy." Her eyes, mad but cogent, shifted briefly to the gunslinger. "You both will be finding that out." Eddie wrapped his hands around the bicycle grips at the ends and the push handles on the back of her wheelchair, and they began north again, now leaving not only footprints, but the twin tracks of the lady's chair as they moved up the seemingly endless beach.